20 years had passed since the day Echo's transmission had shattered the Covenant's grip on the galaxy. And the universe had become a very different place. Sarah Chun stood at the window of the Galactic Concorde's Great Assembly Hall, looking out at the ships from 100 different worlds that had gathered to witness this historic moment. She was young for a diplomat, only 32 years old, but she had been chosen to represent humanity at the ceremony that would formally recognize Earth as a founding member of the new galactic order. Was an honor that would have been impossible just 2 decades ago. And Sarah knew exactly who deserved the credit for making it possible. The ceremony itself was beautiful and moving, filled with speeches about unity and cooperation and the bright future that all species would build together. Sarah delivered her own speech with passion and conviction, and she felt tears in her eyes when the representatives of 40 different species rose to applaud humanity's acceptance into the Concorde. After the ceremony ended and the crowds began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the stars. That was when the elderly Velthari ambassador approached her. He was old, ancient by the standards of his species, and his silver skin had faded to a dull gray that spoke of many years and many sorrows. "You spoke well today," he said in a voice that crackled with age. "Your words reminded me of someone I met once, a long time ago." Sarah turned to look at him with curiosity. "Who?" she asked. "A human woman," he said, "though I did not know she was human at the time. She saved my grandmother's life on a small moon called Virith 7. And my grandmother never stopped talking about her until the day she died." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "You mean Echo?" she whispered. The old Velthari nodded slowly. "I met her once, many years after she saved my family," he said. "I was young and foolish, and I thought I could help her with whatever mission she was pursuing, but she would not let me get close enough to die beside her." He reached into his robes and pulled out a small metallic chip that glowed with a faint blue light. "I spent 20 years searching for any trace of her after she disappeared," he continued. "And 3 years ago, I finally found something." Sarah stared at the chip with wide eyes. "What is it?" she asked. "Her ship was called the Whisper," the old Velthari said, "and it had an AI that recorded everything she did during her mission. The ship was destroyed during the battle at the Nexus Archive, but the AI's core memory survived." He held out the chip towards Sarah with trembling hands. "The AI had one final instruction programmed into it," he said. "It was supposed to wait until humanity was truly free, and then deliver its contents to someone who would make sure she was remembered." Sarah took the chip carefully, as if it might break if she held it too tightly. "Why me?" she asked. The old Velthari smiled sadly. "Because you are the face of humanity's future," he said. "And I think she would have wanted someone like you to know the truth about who she really was." That night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and inserted the chip into her personal computer. A holographic image appeared before her, a woman with tired eyes and short, dark hair and the bearing of a soldier who had seen too many battles. The woman's hands trembled visibly, and Sarah could see the signs of the neural damage that was slowly destroying her mind. "My name is Alara Vance," the woman said, and her voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion. Sarah felt tears begin to fall down her cheeks as she listened. "I was a commander in the United Terran Navy," Alara continued, "and I had a cat named Mizzo, and I never learned how to cook no matter how many times I tried." She laughed softly, and it was a sad sound. "I loved old movies, the kind with practical effects and cheesy dialogue, and I told terrible puns that made everyone around me groan." Her smile faded slightly. "I was afraid of the dark when I was little, and sometimes I still am, though. I suppose that is a strange thing to admit for someone who spent 3 years traveling through the darkness between stars." She paused and looked directly at the camera, and Sarah felt as if the woman was looking straight into her soul. "I am recording this," because soon I will not remember any of it," Alara said. "My disease is taking my memories away piece by piece. And I need someone to know that Echo was not just a codename, she was a person." She took a deep, shaky breath. "I was a person," she repeated. "And I want someone to remember that after I am gone." The recording continued for nearly an hour, with Alara sharing stories about her childhood and her military career and the small moments of joy and sorrow that had made up her life. She talked about the parents she had lost and the friends she had left behind and the life she had given up to become a ghost. She talked about the fear she felt every time she went into battle and the hope she clung to every time she helped someone who needed help. And at the end, she looked at the camera one final time and spoke directly to whoever might be watching. "I do not know if what I am doing will matter," she said. "But humans have always been good at one thing, we echo." She smiled. "And it was small and sad and defiant all at once. We pass things on," she continued. "Stories and hopes and warnings. We leave pieces of ourselves behind in the people we touch. And those pieces ripple outward in ways we will never see." She leaned closer to the camera. "I might be forgotten, but if I do this right, what I stood for will not be forgotten. So if you are watching this, whoever you are, do me a favor." Sarah leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Remember that you matter," Alara said. "Remember that the small things you do, the kindnesses you show, and the people you help ripple outward in ways you will never understand." She paused, and her smile widened. "And if anyone ever asks about the human called Echo, tell them she was stubborn as hell, and she never knew when to quit." The recording ended, and Sarah sat in silence for a long time with tears streaming down her face. She thought about Alara Vance, the woman behind the legend, the person behind the codename, and she felt a deep ache of grief for someone she had never met. But underneath the grief, she felt something else, a burning determination to make sure that Alara's sacrifice would never be forgotten. The next morning, Sarah opened the communication channel to Earth and requested an emergency meeting with the Terran Council. She told them about the recording and about Alara Vance and about the woman who had given up everything to save humanity. The Intelligence Bureau tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable, and besides, 20 years had passed, and the people who had created Operation Echo were mostly dead or retired within a year. A statue of Alara Vance stood in the central plaza of New Geneva, showing a woman with tired eyes and a soldier's bearing looking up at the stars. A memorial was built at the site where she had been born, and her name was added to every history book on Earth. The neural severance that had erased her from memory could not be reversed. The people who had known her would never remember her face, but her name was finally spoken aloud again after 20 years of silence. And across the galaxy, in every corner where Echo's legend had spread, beings of 100 different species learned that the mysterious hero who had freed them had been a real person with a real name. Alara Vance, commander of the United Terran Navy, a woman who loved old movies and terrible puns and was afraid of the dark, a woman who had given everything and asked for nothing in return, a woman who had been forgotten by all but whose codename had echoed across the galaxy and changed the course of history. Sarah Chen visited the statue every year on the anniversary of ECHO's final transmission, and each time she stood there she whispered the same words: "Thank you, Alara, we remember now, and we will never forget again." And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, in a tomb orbiting a dead sun, the echo of a woman's sacrifice continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing hearts, and proving that one person could make a difference, even a person who had been forgotten by everyone who had ever known her, even a ghost who had become a legend, even a human named Alara Vance, who had shown the galaxy what it truly meant to be human. The galaxy burned with the fire of awakening, and nothing would ever be the same again within hours of ECHO's final transmission. The archive's contents had spread to every corner of known space. Billions of beings on thousands of worlds watched in horror as the truth about the Covenant unfolded before their eyes. Species that had trusted the Covenant for generations saw recordings of their ancestors being quietly eliminated. Worlds that had believed themselves to be protected learned that they were merely being managed, until the Covenant decided they had outlived their usefulness. The lies that had held galactic civilization together for millions of years crumbled like dust in the wind in the Covenant homeworlds. Chaos erupted as citizens demanded answers from their leaders. 3 of the 12 ruling species were overthrown within the first year, their governments toppled by their own populations, who could no longer stomach the crimes that had been committed in their names. The remaining 9 tried desperately to maintain control, but the damage was already done. Trade alliances that had existed for millennia dissolved. Overnight, military pacts were abandoned as former allies turned on each other in a scramble to distance themselves from the Covenant's legacy. Species that had been rivals for generations found themselves united by a common enemy, and new alliances began to form in the spaces left behind by the old order. And through all of this upheaval, one question echoed across the galaxy. Who was Echo? The Covenant claimed she was a terrorist, a human extremist who had stolen classified information and released it without understanding the consequences. But the people who had actually met her told a different story. Vern, the Kathiri merchant, gave interviews to anyone who would listen, describing the human woman who had saved his life and asked for nothing in return. She was not a terrorist, he said over and over again. She was a hero, the bravest person I have ever known, and I am honored to have fought beside her. Sorrel traveled from world to world, sharing his grandmother's story about the woman who had saved the Velthari refugees on Vara 7. My grandmother was an empath, he told crowds of thousands, and she said that Echo's soul burned brighter than anyone she had ever encountered. She said that Echo would change everything, and she was right. The stories multiplied and spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Everyone who had ever been helped by Echo came forward to share their experiences, and each story added another layer to the legend that was growing around her name. She had walked into impossible situations and walked out victorious. She had faced death 100 times and never backed down. She had shown kindness to strangers when kindness was the last thing anyone expected from a human. But the most remarkable thing about Echo was not what she had done. It was why she had done it in a galaxy where every species fought for its own survival and looked out only for its own interests. ECHO had sacrificed everything for people who were not her own kind. She had given up her name and her memories and her very identity to save a species that was not even grateful for her sacrifice, and in the end, she had died alone in a forgotten tomb, surrounded by enemies, with no one to hold her hand or tell her that she mattered. It was the kind of story that transcended species barriers and cultural differences. It was the kind of story that made people look at humanity in a completely new way on Earth. The United Terran government maintained its official silence about Operation ECHO. The Intelligence Bureau refused to confirm or deny that Echo had been a human agent, and they certainly did not reveal that her real name had been Alara. Vance's apartment in New Geneva remained occupied by strangers who had no memory of the woman who had lived there before her. Hometown records showed no evidence that she had ever been born as far as the official history of Earth was concerned. ECHO had simply appeared from nowhere, a mystery wrapped in a legend wrapped in a Codename, but the legend did not need official confirmation to grow resistant cells across the galaxy began, calling themselves Echoes, and they adopted her symbol, a simple circle with a single line through it, representing a voice that could not be silenced. Graffiti appeared on Covenant stations and government buildings. Spray-painted messages that read Echo lives, and we remember, and the truth cannot be erased. Children of a dozen species played games where the hero was a mysterious human who came from nowhere and saved everyone. Parents told their children stories about Echo at bedtime, teaching them that courage and kindness could change the world. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, humanity's place in the galaxy began to shift. For centuries, the Covenant had classified humans as a containment tier species, a young and dangerous race that needed to be controlled and eventually eliminated. But Echo had shattered that narrative completely. How could humanity be a threat that needed to be contained when one of their own had sacrificed everything to free the galaxy? How could they be dangerous when the most famous human in history was known not for conquest or violence, but for compassion and selflessness? The other species began to look at humanity differently, and they began to see potential allies where they had once seen only enemies. Trade routes that had been closed to human ships began to reopen. Diplomatic channels that had been severed for decades were quietly restored, and on the edges of Covenant space, where the old order was crumbling fastest, humans began to be welcomed as friends rather than feared as threats. 5 years after ECHO's final transmission, a new organization emerged from the ashes of the Covenant, the Galactic Concord, an alliance of species committed to building a better future together. Humanity was invited to join as a founding member, a recognition that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. The invitation letter specifically mentioned Echo by name, crediting her sacrifice as the catalyst that had made the new alliance possible. We do not know who she was or where she came from, the letter read, but we know what she stood for, and we believe that any species capable of producing such a person deserves a place at the table of galactic civilization on Earth. The news was celebrated with parades and festivals and speeches from politicians who had never known Echo existed but in the shadows. The people who had actually created her watched in silence. The Intelligence Bureau had achieved everything it had hoped for when it launched Operation Echo. Humanity was safe. The Covenant was broken, and the galaxy was being remade in ways that favored human interests. But the men and women who had erased Alara Vance from existence could not celebrate. They knew what the galaxy did not, that Echo had been a real person with a real name and a real life that had been stolen from her. They knew that she had been dying when she volunteered, and that she had accepted her mission, knowing that she would never be thanked or remembered or mourned. They knew that she had given everything, and they could never give anything back. The handler who had recruited her, the man with no name and no emotion in his voice, retired from the Intelligence Bureau 1 year after ECHO's death. He moved to a small cabin in the mountains of northern Canada, and he spent his days staring at the stars and wondering if he had done the right thing. He could not remember her real name anymore. The neural severance had taken that from him along with everyone else, but he remembered her codename. And he remembered the look in her eyes when she had asked him to promise that people would remember what she did. He had kept that promise. Even if he could never tell anyone how ECO would never be forgotten. Her real name might be lost to history, but her legend would live forever, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the galaxy was slowly learning what it meant to be human. The Nexus Archive floated in the darkness of a dead system, orbiting a collapsed star that gave off no light and no warmth, a tomb hidden in the emptiest corner of the galaxy where no one was ever supposed to find it. TCHO stared at the ancient structure through her ship's viewport, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel something like hope after 3 years of running and hiding and fighting and slowly losing pieces of her mind. She had finally reached her destination, but the hope died in her chest when her sensors detected what was waiting for her: a Covenant war fleet hung in the space between her ship and the archive. Dozens of massive warships, bristling with weapons that could vaporize the Whisper in a single shot. Someone had betrayed her. Someone had told the Covenant exactly where she was going and exactly when she would arrive. ECHO felt a strange calm settle over her as she looked at the fleet that stood between her and everything she had sacrificed to reach. She had always known this might happen, and she had prepared for it in ways that no one, not even the Covenant, could have predicted. "Open a channel," she said to the ship's AI. "Broadcast on all frequencies that I have been using for the past 3 years." "Channel open?" The AI responded. Isiko took a deep breath and spoke into the void. "This is Echo," she said, "and I am calling in every debt that has ever been owed to me. I am at the Nexus Archive, and I need your help." For a long moment there was only silence, and ECHO wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by believing that the connection she had built actually meant anything. Then the first ship dropped out of slipspace. Behind her was a battered smuggler vessel held together with patches and prayers, and its captain was a Kathiri merchant named Vaughn, who Echo had saved from pirates 2 years ago. "You helped me when I had nothing to offer you." Vaughn's voice crackled over the communication channel. "So now I am here to help you. Whatever you need, Echo, I will give it." More ships began appearing, dozens of them, then hundreds, pouring out of slipspace. Like stars being born from the darkness, there were refugee transports and cargo haulers, and stolen military vessels and tiny personal craft that had no business being anywhere near a battlefield. There were Velthari and Kathiri, and a dozen other species that Eco had helped over the past 3 years. And they had all come because a human woman had shown them kindness when kindness was the last thing they expected. Sorrel's voice came through the channel, young and fierce and full of determination. "My grandmother was right about you," he said, "and we are not going to let you face this alone." Echo felt tears burning in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Listen to me carefully," she said to the fleet that had gathered around her. "The Covenant wants to stop me from reaching the archive because they are afraid of what is inside, and they should be afraid, because inside that structure is proof of every crime they have ever committed against the younger species of this galaxy." A murmur of voices responded over the channel, and Echo could hear the anger and the hope mixing together into something powerful. "I am going to reach that archive," she continued, "and I am going to release everything inside it to every corner of the galaxy. But I need you to buy me time." She paused and forced herself to speak the words that she knew might condemn many of them to death. "Some of you will not survive this battle," she said, "and I cannot promise you that your sacrifice will change anything. All I can promise is that if I succeed, the galaxy will finally know the truth." Vaughn's voice came back immediately. "We did not come here expecting to survive," he said. "We came here because you showed us that humans are not like the Covenant. You helped us when you did not have to. And now we choose to help you because it is the right thing to do." The battle began moments later. The Covenant fleet opened fire on the ragtag armada that had gathered to protect Eco, and ships began exploding in brilliant flashes of light that lit up the darkness like dying stars. ECOO pushed the Whisper forward through the chaos, weaving between explosions and debris and the hulks of destroyed vessels. Her ship took hit after hit, and alarms screamed throughout the cockpit as systems failed one after another, but she kept going, because stopping was not an option and never had been. When the Whisper finally gave out completely, ECHO was already in her EVA suit, and launching herself toward the archive through the vacuum of space. She clutched a data spike in her trembling hands, a device that could interface with any computer system and download its contents in seconds. Her headache was blinding now, and she could feel her thoughts scattering like leaves in a wind, but she held on to her purpose with everything she had left, repeating it over and over in her mind like a prayer. Reach the archive, release the truth, save humanity. She breached the archive's outer shell through an ancient airlock that had not been opened in millennia, and she found herself floating through corridors filled with dust and silence and the weight of forgotten history. The heart of the archive was a vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with soft blue light. And Echo knew instinctively that she was looking at the largest repository of information in the entire galaxy. She connected her data spike to the central console and began the upload. Files flooded through her device and out into the galaxy, records of species that had been erased from existence, evidence of resources stolen and populations enslaved, proof that the Covenant had been systematically eliminating any species that threatened their power for millions of years. Humanity was just the latest on a list that stretched back to the beginning of galactic civilization. ECHO watched the upload progress and felt a grim satisfaction spreading through her chest. Even if she died right here in this ancient tomb, the truth would survive. Every ship in the galaxy with an open communication channel was receiving the archive's contents right now, and nothing the Covenant could do would ever put this information back in the box. Then she heard the sound of metal scraping against metal, and she turned to see Covenant hunter drones pouring into the chamber. Through every entrance, they were small and fast and deadly, designed specifically to hunt down intruders in places where larger forces could not go. Ikacho drew her weapon and began firing, but there were too many of them, and her hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. A drone's blade sliced across her arm, and she felt blood spraying in the zero gravity. Another drone struck her leg, and she screamed in pain but did not stop fighting. The upload was almost complete. Just a few more seconds, and everything she had suffered would mean something. With her last burst of strength, ECHO activated her suit's emergency broadcast system and spoke into the void one final time. "We are not alone," she said, her voice ragged with pain and exhaustion. "We were never meant to be caged, remember?" The final file uploaded, and the entire galaxy received the truth simultaneously. Then the drones overwhelmed her, and Echo's transmission went silent outside the archive. The battle raged on for another hour before the Covenant fleet finally retreated in confusion. Their commanders had just received the same transmission as everyone else, and they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Sorel searched the archive for 3 days, hoping to find some sign that Echo had survived. All he found was her data spike, still connected to the console, still blinking with a small green light that indicated the upload had been successful. He took it with him when he left, and he promised himself that he would never forget the human woman who had given everything to set the galaxy free. 3 years passed in the darkness between stars, and Echo became something that the galaxy had never seen before, a human who existed nowhere and belonged to no one, yet somehow left her mark on everything she touched. Her ship was called the Whisper, and it was small enough to slip through Covenant sensor nets and fast enough to outrun most patrol vessels. The AI that ran the ship had no name, but Echo talked to it anyway during the long, lonely stretches of travel when there was nothing to do but wait and think and feel her mind slowly slipping away from her. "How long until we reach the next waypoint?" she asked one morning as she sat in the pilot's seat and watched the stars drift past the viewport. "Approximately 47 days, the AI responded in its flat, mechanical voice. 47 more days of nothing but silence and darkness and the constant humming of the ship's engines. CCOCO closed. her eyes and tried to remember the face of her mother. But all she could find was a blur where the memory should have been, whether from the neural severance or from her disease. She could not tell anymore. The fringe territories were a lawless place. A vast stretch of space between Covenant jurisdiction where smugglers and pirates and refugees carved out whatever existence they could. Manage it was dangerous and unpredictable, and exactly the kind of place where a ghost could disappear completely. But Echo did not disappear. Instead, she became visible in ways she had never intended, because she could not stop herself from helping people who needed help. The first time it happened was on a small moon called Verith 7, where a group of Velthari refugees had been stranded after their transport ship broke down. The Velthari were a species of empaths, tall, slender beings with silver skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's. So, they had fled Covenant territory after their homeworld was quietly absorbed into a protectorate that stripped away all their rights and freedoms. ECHO found them huddled in a damaged cargo bay, starving and afraid and waiting for death to find them. She did not have to help them. Her mission required her to avoid attention and stay hidden and move toward the Nexus archive without getting involved in other people's problems. But when she saw the children clinging to their parents with terror in their eyes, something inside her refused to walk away. She spent 3 days repairing their ship and sharing her own food supplies and teaching them which trade routes were safe to travel. When she finally prepared to leave, an elderly Velthari woman approached her with tears streaming down her silver face. "Why did you help us?" The woman asked. "You are human, and we are nothing to you. We cannot pay you, and we cannot help your mission. So why would you risk yourself for strangers?" Echo thought about the question for a long moment. "Because someone should," she finally said. "And I was here." The woman reached out and touched Echo's forehead with gentle fingers, and Echo felt a strange warmth spread through her mind as the Velthari's empathic abilities connected them for just a brief moment. "You carry so much pain," the woman whispered. "So much grief and loneliness and fear. Yet underneath all of that, there is something I have never felt before in any being. What is it?" Echo asked. "Purpose," the woman said. "A purpose so strong and so bright that it burns like a star in the center of your soul." She pulled her hand away and looked at Echo with something like wonder. "I do not know what mission drives you, human, but I know this: you will change everything, and the galaxy will never be the same after you have passed through it." Echo wanted to believe her, but the headaches were getting worse, and sometimes she forgot words in the middle of sentences, and sometimes she woke up not knowing where she was or how she had gotten there. Disease was advancing faster than the doctors had predicted, and she knew that she was running out of time, but she kept moving forward anyway, because stopping was not something she knew how to do over. The next 2 years she helped a Cathiri merchant escape from pirates who had been hunting him for months. She exposed a Covenant operation that had been secretly harvesting genetic material from sentient species without their consent. She walked into a hostage situation on a space station where a crime lord was holding 46 children captive, and she walked out with all 46 children alive and the crime lord's body cooling on the floor behind her. Each time she helped someone, she asked for nothing in return. Each time she disappeared before anyone could properly thank her or learn who she truly was. But stories began to spread through the fringe territory, stories of a mysterious human woman who appeared from nowhere and saved people and then vanished. Like smoke in the wind, they called her the Ghost, and then they called her the Shadow, and then finally they began to call her by the name that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. They called her Echo, a young Velthari empath named Sorrel found her on a trading station one night and he sat down across from her in a crowded cantina without asking permission. "I know what you are," he said quietly. ECO's hand moved toward the weapon hidden under her coat. But something in the young man's eyes made her hesitate. "My grandmother told me about you," Sorrel continued. "She said you saved her life 3 years ago on Vareth 7. And she said I would know you if I ever saw you, because your soul burns brighter than anyone else in any room." ECHO relaxed slightly, but did not take her hand away from her weapon. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to understand," Sorrel said. "I want to understand how a human can carry so much death inside her and still fight so hard to protect life." Echo looked at him for a long moment, and she saw that he was young and idealistic and probably did not understand how dangerous it was to be seen talking to her. "I am dying," she said simply. "And I have been dying for a long time. But dying does not mean I have to stop living. And it does not mean I have to stop caring about what happens to other people." Sorrel leaned forward with intensity burning in his dark eyes. "My grandmother said you would change everything," he said. "And I believe her, so I am asking you to let me help." Echo shook her head. "I cannot let anyone help me," she said, "because everyone who gets close to me becomes a target, and I will not be responsible for more death than I have already caused." But Sorrel did not give up. And over the following months, Echo found herself building something she had never expected to build. A network of allies scattered across the fringe territories. People she had helped who wanted to help her, and return smugglers who owed her their lives began passing her information about Covenant patrol pattern scientists who had defected from the Covenant, shared their knowledge of the Nexus Archive's defenses, refugees, and outcasts and criminals who had been touched by her kindness pledged themselves to her cause, without even knowing what that cause truly was. And through it all, ECHO's mind continued to crumble. Piece by piece, she recorded everything now, every thought and every memory and every moment of clarity, because she knew that soon she would not be able to trust her own brain anymore. "Why do you keep recording the ships of?" I asked her one night. ECHO looked at the blinking light that indicated the AI was listening, and she smiled sadly. "Because someone needs to remember," she said. "Even if that someone is just a machine." She was getting close to the Nexus Archive now, and she could feel the end of her journey approaching like a storm on the horizon. She was not afraid. She had already died once. When they erased her name and her memories and her place in the world, everything that came after was just borrowed time. And she intended to spend every last second of it making sure her death meant something. Commander Alara Vance sat alone in the cold white room, and she knew that by tomorrow morning she would cease to exist, not through death, but through something far stranger and more complete than dying could ever be. A man across the table wore no uniform and carried no identification, and when he spoke his voice held no emotion at all. "You understand what we are asking of you?" he said. Alara nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the metal table between them. "You will be erased," he continued. "And I do not mean this as a figure of speech or dramatic language. I mean it in the most literal sense possible." She had read the files, and she understood exactly what Operation Echo would require of her. The procedure was called neural severance, and it used advanced technology that humanity had secretly developed over the past decade, technology that could reach into the minds of every person who had ever known Alara Vance and remove her from their memories completely. Her mother and father were already dead, which made things simpler. In some ways she had no husband and no children, and her few friends from the military would wake up tomorrow with gaps in their recollections that their brains would simply fill with other things. Her apartment would be reassigned to strangers who would never wonder about the woman who had lived there before. Her service records would vanish from every database, and her metals would be melted down and recycled into something else entirely. She would become a ghost, not a dead woman haunting the living, but something worse, a living woman whom no one could remember had ever been alive at all. "I understand," Elara said, and her voice did not shake even though something deep inside her chest felt like it was cracking apart. The man slid a tablet across the table toward her, and on its screen glowed the words that would seal her fate. "Before you sign, I need you to understand why we need you specifically," he said. Elara already knew the answer to this question, but she let him explain anyway. "The Covenant of 12 has ruled this galaxy for longer than human civilization has existed," he began, "and they have decided that humanity is too dangerous to be allowed to grow any further." She had seen the reports, the quiet strangling of human colonies through bureaucratic means, the closing of trade routes, the denial of resources that Earth's expanding population desperately needed. The Covenant species were ancient and powerful, and they had perfected the art of killing younger species without ever firing a single weapon. They simply waited and watched and tightened their grip until the newer species withered away and died. And then they erased all evidence that those species had ever existed at all. Humanity was next on their list. And most humans did not even realize it was happening. "We have discovered something," the man continued. "Something that could change everything. The location of a place called the Nexus Archive." Elara leaned forward slightly, because this was the part of the briefing that had convinced her to volunteer for this mission. The Nexus Archive was supposedly a myth, a legend whispered about in the darkest corners of the galaxy, a repository of information so vast and so dangerous that the Covenant had hidden it away and forbidden anyone from ever speaking of it. But human intelligence operatives had found proof that it was real, and more importantly, they had found coordinates that might lead someone to its location. The archive contains records of everything the Covenant has done for millions of years, the man said, including evidence of every species they have quietly eliminated and every crime they have committed against the younger races of this galaxy. If that information could be released to the rest of the galaxy, it would shatter the Covenant's carefully constructed image of benevolent leadership. Species that had been enemies for millennia might find common cause against their true oppressors. The entire galactic order could be transformed overnight, but the journey to the archive will take years, the man said. And whoever makes that journey cannot have any connections to Earth or to humanity. They must be a complete unknown, a person with no past and no ties that could be traced back to us. That was why they needed someone who could be erased. That was why they needed a ghost. "There is one more thing you should know," the man said. And for the first time, his voice carried something that might have been hesitation. Ella waited. "We chose you not just because of your skills or your lack of family connections," he admitted, "but also because of your medical condition." She felt her jaw tighten, but she did not look away. The doctors had told her 18 months ago that she had a degenerative neural disease, something rare and untreatable, that would slowly destroy her mind piece by piece until there was nothing left. She had kept it secret from everyone, except her commanding officers. And apparently, they had decided to make use of her dying in a way that might actually matter. "You are already running out of time," the man said, "and we are offering you a chance to spend whatever time you have left doing something that could save your entire species." Elara thought about her empty apartment and her erased memories and the slow death that was already eating away at her brain. She thought about the children growing up on Earth's colonies who would never have a chance to become anything because the Covenant had already decided their fate. She thought about what it meant to be human, to be stubborn and foolish and brave enough to fight against impossible odds simply because giving up felt worse than dying. "Give me the tablet," she said. She signed her name one last time, knowing it would be the last time that name would ever mean anything to anyone. The man took the tablet back and stood up from the table. "The procedure will happen tonight," he said. "And by morning, you will be given a new face and a new identity, and a ship that will carry you into the darkness between stars." He paused at the door and looked back at her with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. She could not tell which. "Your codename will be Echo," he said. "And that is the only name you will carry from this point forward. Alarino." ECHO now stood up and faced him with steady eyes. "You said I would be forgotten," she said. "But I want you to promise me something." He waited. "Promise me that even if no one remembers who I was, they will remember what I did." The man nodded once, and then he was gone. ECHO stood alone in the cold white room, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief exactly, but something like the feeling of closing the door for the final time. She was no longer Commander Alara Vance of the United Terran Navy. She was no longer a woman with a history and a name and a place in the world. She was Echo now, a ghost with a mission and a countdown timer ticking away inside her. Skull tomorrow she would launch into the void and begin a journey that might take years and might kill her long before she reached her destination. But tonight she allowed herself one final moment of humanity, one final moment of fear and sadness and longing for the life she was leaving behind. And then she straightened her shoulders and walked out of the room and did not look back. The stars were waiting for her, and she had promises to keep.